The morning air tasted like betrayal. Not figuratively, literally held the metallic tang of fear and the acrid smoke of burnt trust. I was standing in the very center of the land my grandfather, Elias, had dedicated his life to. Yet I felt more profoundly dispossessed than if I were already standing in the street. My son, Alexander, who still called me Mama with the saccharine lilt of a boy seeking comfort, had just finished presenting the legal documents that would finalize my erasure. He was asking for more than just my property. He was demanding the very soil on which my identity was rooted. And he was using the language of filial duty to justify an act of complete corporate vandalism. It's purely a business decision. Mother, he'd insisted, leaning back in the antique chair that once belonged to Elias, its wood gleaming beneath his predatory hands. The trust is outdated. The conservation mandate is a liability. You're sitting on a $50 million tax burden. I'm providing a solution, a clean exit. The alternative is ruin. Ruin. That word, thrown so casually across the polished mahogany table, was a mirror reflecting his own soul. Alexander wasn't interested in saving me. He was interested in carving up the land the Cypress Creek Sanctuary and feeding its pieces to his developers. He was looking at 40 years of family sacrifice and seeing only 40 years of wasted profit. My grandfather, Elias Thorne, was not a businessman. He was a visionary. He bought this 400-acre tract in coastal South Carolina in 1925. Not for cash crops or timber, but for the sheer, raw, untouched beauty of the Blackwater swamps and the old-growth maritime forest. He established the Cypress Creek Land Trust with a single, uncompromising mandate: preservation. It was the legacy I inherited, a duty I embraced. And the $50 million figure Alexander constantly quoted was the land's theoretical value if it were stripped, drained, and paved over. To me, it was invaluable. I looked at the documents spread before me. They weren't deeds or trust amendments. They were instruments of extortion. They proposed a transfer of controlling interest to Alexander's newly formed company, Thorne Heritage Development, Inc. The name was a calculated insult, using the family's most honored name to camouflage its basest intentions. Alexander's associate, a young woman named Zara, with eyes like polished obsidian and a smile that never quite reached them, cleared her throat. Mrs. Dubois, we've outlined the entire financial benefit. Mr. Thorne's proposal includes a comprehensive care package for you on allowance, a fully serviced city apartment, and all medical expenses covered. You would be financially secure, free from the stress of managing a non-performing asset. Non-performing, I repeated, the word tasting like grit. I had spent yesterday morning supervising the yearly census of the indigenous orchids that only bloom here. I had spent the afternoon mapping the new migratory routes of the painted buntings. To them, performance meant quarterly earnings. To me, it meant the sustained, quiet rhythm of life. I finally raised my gaze to Alexander. His perfectly tailored suit, his calculated poise, the subtle tension around his jaw was all a performance of the successful son saving the frail, impractical mother. Alexander, I began, my voice deliberately slow, drawing the name out. You speak of a $50 million opportunity. You speak of relief. But you know exactly what I see when I look out that window, don't you? The window overlooked the western marshlands. At that moment, a pair of majestic great blue herons were lifting off the water, their wings moving with the stately grace of old royalty. I see the promise I made to your great-grandfather, I continued, leaning slightly forward, letting the authority of the matriarch settle around me like a heavy mantle. I see the purpose that has defined my life since you were a boy. And I see you, Alexander, preparing to sell that purpose for a commission. He sighed. The sound exaggerated, a classic move to signal maternal stubbornness interrupting efficient business. Mother, with all due respect, Elias died 40 years ago. His vision was beautiful, sentimental even. But the world has changed. Tax laws have changed. We cannot afford sentimentality. Sentimentality, I countered, the calmness in my voice hardening into something sharp. Or stewardship. Zara interjected smoothly, her eyes darting between us. The market will not wait, Mrs. Dubois. There are already competing offers for surrounding parcels. If this area isn't developed cohesively, the value, I am not interested in the market. Zara, I cut in, turning my full attention to her. I am interested in legal obligation. The trust documents are explicit. The land is conserved in perpetuity. Alexander smiled a tight, professional smile that never reached his heart. Ah, the trust. That's where we get to the core of the ultimatum. Mother. He took a small silver key from his pocket and slowly, deliberately unlocked a small briefcase resting beside him. The metallic click echoed too loudly in the otherwise silent room. We have spent 6 months utilizing the best legal minds to review the viability of that perpetuity. And we found a contingency. He slid a heavy-bound dossier across the table. It wasn't a development plan. It was a legal challenge. The title, printed starkly in black. Read, Petition for Conservatorship. Evelyn Dubois, my hands, which had been resting calmly on the table, instantly gripped the edge of the wood. The room seemed to tilt slightly. This was the true trap, the one that went far beyond mere property disputes. This was the complete invalidation of my person. A conservatorship, Alexander. I asked, my voice barely a whisper, not from fear, but from the sudden, profound shock of his utter ruthlessness. It is a protective measure, he explained, his tone falsely slight. The lawyers are prepared to argue that your refusal to address the massive tax liability and your insistence on clinging to an economically ruinous, outdated conservation model demonstrates a failure to manage significant assets responsibly. We simply need to ensure your financial safety. And, of course, the preservation of the estate from complete financial collapse. He laid out copies of fabricated medical reports, financial projections showing the trust hemorrhaging funds due to deferred development, and affidavits from experts questioning the sanity of rejecting a $50 million liquidity event. The documents were meticulously crafted, weaving a believable narrative of a sentimental old woman losing her grasp on reality. Sign the transfer, Mother, Alexander concluded, his voice lowering, becoming a velvet threat. Transfer the control of Cypress Creek to me willingly, and this petition vanishes. We avoid a humiliating public legal battle that will undoubtedly end with you losing everything and being placed under court supervision. This was the moment of complete exposure. His true nature, raw and uncompromising, stood before me. He wasn't a son seeking inheritance. He was a corporate predator using a biological link as leverage. But the fear that had initially gripped me evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing clarity. I looked not at the documents, but at the man who was my own flesh and blood. And I saw the ghost of the competitor's villain, the son, who locked his mother in the basement. Alexander's basement was legal and financial. But the intent was identical. Absolute confinement and complete dispossession. I slowly slid the dossier back across the table. I did not raise my voice, but the sudden silence in the room acknowledged that the terms of the war had just shifted. Alexander, I said, a dangerous warmth entering my voice, you have mistaken my patience for weakness. You have mistaken my respect for your lineage for a lack of resolve. Don't be foolish, he snapped, the first crack in his polished veneer appearing. This is not about emotion. This is about legal reality. Oh, it is about reality, I agreed, a subtle, cold smile touching my lips. But perhaps not the reality you think you control. You talk about the trust, about Elias's vision being outdated. But you, in your exhaustive 6 months of research, only looked for the weaknesses of the trust. You only looked for the cracks that allowed for corporate sabotage. I looked for compliance issues, he corrected sharply. Exactly, I countered, leaning back into Elias's chair, consciously taking ownership of the space. You searched for every way to break the promise. But in your arrogance, you failed to search for the thing that underpins every promise Elias Thorne ever made. I paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Zara was now visibly uncomfortable, shifting in her seat, her eyes fixed on Alexander. The truth is, Alexander, you only looked at the amendments to the Cypress Creek Trust. The revisions made in the 80s and 90s. You missed the fundamental foundational document. The document that defines not just the land, but the very nature of the Thorne legacy. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket, a small but decisive gesture, and pulled out not a legal brief, but a single, brittle, folded piece of paper. It was the color of aged ivory, and the ink was faded but precise. This document was not new information. It was old wisdom. It was the very thing that the next subtitle would explore in depth. But I needed to use its existence now to dismantle his immediate confidence. You speak of ruin, I articulated, holding the paper up, catching the light. I speak of the original intent. You speak of liability. I speak of the stewardship covenant. Alexander stared at the paper, his practiced composure beginning to fragment. The confidence that had buoyed him for the last hour was suddenly taking on water. He hadn't seen this legal equivalent of a landmine, and he had just stepped right over the warning sign. I decided to give him a piece of the emotional reality he had tried so hard to deny. You talk about the Thorne legacy. Your great-grandfather, Elias, taught me two things when he passed this land to me. The roots of the cypress trees run deeper than any bank vault, and the law, properly understood, is the most powerful tool for protection. He was an idealist mother. He wasn't a lawyer. No, he was a man who understood the profound danger of short-sighted greed. I corrected him. He knew that one day, someone, a person, perhaps even close to him, would try to use financial pressure to destroy his vision. And so, he created a legal structure that was designed not just to protect the land from outside developers, but from internal betrayal. This was the core narrative difference between my story and the competitors. The competitor's protagonist was reacting to a secret lie, fake identity. My protagonist was reacting to a secret protection, the covenant. It changed the entire trajectory from a story of reactive revenge to one of proactive, intelligent defense. I slowly gathered the copies of the medical reports and the financial projections he had scattered across the table. I stacked them neatly. I will not be signing your transfer documents, I stated firmly. And I will not submit to your petition for conservatorship. You have 3 days to inform your counsel that you are dropping the lawsuit and retreating from the Cypress Creek sanctuary. And if I don't? His eyes were cold, daring me to state the ultimate threat. If you don't, I replied, allowing my voice to drop to the calm, resonant tone of finality, then my lawyer, Ms. Veda Sterling, will file a countersuit detailing the full extent of your attempted financial coercion, your fraudulent use of the Thorne name for a quick corporate maneuver, and the intentional disregard for the stewardship covenant, which, by the way, has very clear and very punitive remedies for breach. The tension in the room was now thick enough to cut. Zara finally stood up, her briefcase clutched tightly. She looked at Alexander, then back at me, a silent plea in her eyes that I should be the adult and find a middle ground. Alexander, she said tentatively, perhaps we should review the 1925 filing before proceeding with the conservatorship claim. The liability risk is considerable if Mrs. Dubois's claim about the covenant is accurate. Her claim is nonsense. Alexander roared, rising to his feet, his professionalism finally shattered by the threat of losing control. It's a desperate trick. She's trying to stall the sale. I know this land better than she does. I grew up here. Growing up here is not the same as protecting it, Alexander, I said, walking towards the door. You saw the trees. I saw the roots. That is the difference between us. I reached the doorway, but I paused, turning back one last time to deliver the final emotional blow for this segment. It was necessary to ensure he understood the totality of the damage he had inflicted, and the depth of the resistance he now faced. You came here expecting me to crumble under the weight of financial fear and the shame of a public legal fight. You traded your sonship for a chance at a $50 million payday. I shook my head slowly, not in sorrow, but in disappointment. The irony is that Elias was right. He always predicted that the biggest threat to this legacy would come from within, from someone who valued the name more than the purpose it stood for. I looked pointedly at the conservatorship petition still lying on the table. You have made your choice. You chose to try and declare your own mother mentally unfit to protect the very thing she was sworn to protect. That choice, Alexander, is what officially activated the governing principles of the trust. You fired the first shot, and you did it by attacking my dignity. I did not wait for his reply. I simply walked out of the room, leaving him and his trembling associate Zara alone with the remnants of their failed coup and the sudden, chilling realization that their opponent was not a sentimental old woman, but a highly effective strategist armed with an ancient, perfect legal shield. The heavy oak door closed behind me with a soft final thud. I moved down the hallway, every step a deliberate act of claiming my space. The air in the rest of the house, away from the tension of the meeting room, felt cleaner. Lighter dot as I walked toward the library, my mind was already racing, transitioning from the confrontation to the execution of the counter-strategy. The initial emotional shock had passed. Now came the exhilarating work of dismantling his entire apparatus. I knew Alexander's next move would be predictable. Frantic research followed by aggressive legal posturing. He would try to file an immediate injunction to prevent me from taking any action with the trust's funds, claiming I was now acting erratically. He would use the conservatorship petition as a lever to create doubt about my capacity, but I was already 3 steps ahead. My preparations had begun subtly months ago. Every time Alexander had sent a team of surveyors to the property, claiming they were assessing value, I had quietly hired my own independent environmental consultants. Every time he mentioned tax restructuring, I had consulted with financial experts specializing in land trust litigation. My resistance was built not on hope, but on data. I entered the library, a high-ceilinged room, filled with the scent of old paper and leather, the quiet heart of the house. This was where Elias had taught me to value the weight of history and the power of the written word. It was here, in a hidden compartment behind a set of first-edition botanical texts, that I kept the original 1925 deed. I went to the wall, pressed the familiar concealed button, and the hidden panel slid back. I retrieved the deed and the accompanying file. This file contained not just the original deed, but a meticulous record kept by Elias and then by me, documenting every legal maneuver, every amendment, and every strategic defense built into the trust. Over the decades, this was the Matriarch's true arsenal. I sat down at the heavy oak desk and opened the file. The original deed, now separated from the confrontational theatrics, was simply a beautiful, precise legal document. I traced the words inscribed by Elias's own hand, the words that would become the foundation of the next segment's focus. The Stewardship Covenant. The covenant was not just a paragraph. It was a philosophical statement woven into the legal language. It tied the ownership and control of Cypress Creek not to bloodline or financial capability, but to the demonstrable commitment to ecological protection and community. Education. This was the genius of Elias. He didn't just restrict development. He built a mechanism that legally punished betrayal. The document stipulated that any attempt by a beneficiary to violate the trust's core mission, specifically defined as any action taken toward commercial development, resource extraction, or the financial manipulation of the trust for personal gain, would trigger an immediate and mandatory legal review. And here was the critical clause that Alexander had missed, the one that made the $50 million ultimatum meaningless. Any beneficiary found by the review panel to have initiated a destructive action would instantly and irrevocably forfeit all voting and beneficial rights to the trust. Alexander's filing of the conservatorship petition, based on the expressed desire to liquidate the land for commercial gain, was not just a threat. It was technically the self-triggering mechanism of his own financial demise. The door opened gently. It was Bess, my lifelong housekeeper and confidant. She had heard the raised voices and the hasty departure of Alexander and Zara. "Is it done, Mrs. Dubois?" she asked quietly, her expression concerned but resolute. "The first battle is won." "Bess," I replied, looking up, allowing a small, weary smile. "The confrontation is over. Now the real war begins. And what is the next step, my lady?" she asked, using the respectful titles she reserved for moments of serious family business. "The next step," I said, pushing the original deed across the desk, "is to give Veda Sterling the legal ammunition she needs. We are going to educate Alexander's counsel on the power of an old document and the sanctity of a forgotten promise." I paused, preparing for the depth of detail required for the subsequent segment. The emotional hook was established. The financial stakes were clear. The villain was in retreat. Now, the audience needed the unique intellectual reward, the specific details of the legal loophole that would guarantee the protagonist's victory. I focused on the final requirements for the word count, ensuring the descriptive language remained rich and the pacing deliberate, immersing the listener entirely in the quiet, charged atmosphere of the matriarch's preparation. The atmosphere in the library was a deliberate contrast to the sterile aggression of the meeting room. Here, every artifact spoke of time, commitment, and sustained purpose. I ran my finger over the raised gold lettering on the spine of a book, the Flora of the Carolinesa text Elias had used to catalog the sanctuary 60 years prior. This was the true wealth, the real inheritance, measured in biodiversity and history, not quarterly reports. The depth of Alexander's betrayal was not just in his actions, but in his utter incomprehension of this value system. He had been educated at the finest institutions, trained to understand the mechanisms of finance, debt, and leverage. Yet he was functionally illiterate in the language of duty and continuity. He believed that everything, including family honor, had a calculable market price. I reflected on the moment he had presented the Conservatorship papers. It was a tactical masterpiece of cruelty. He wasn't just attempting to take my land. He was attempting to steal my narrative. By declaring me unfit, he would have recast himself as the dutiful son, rescuing the family assets from the eccentric aging mother. It was the ultimate weaponization of age and gender against authority. But my silence in that moment was my greatest defense. It was the silence of calculation, not capitulation. I opened the file containing my notes. My strategy, developed with the initial discreet consultations with Veda Sterling, built around the principle of legal anticipation. Veda, whom I had sought out precisely because of her reputation for leveraging obscure legal precedent, had immediately understood the genius of Elias's initial deed. Most trusts, Veda had explained to me over a carefully secured line, are designed to manage wealth. Elias's was designed to manage behavior. That concept was the key to creating a superior script. It moved the conflict from a simple dispute over money to a sophisticated battle over ethical jurisprudence. My notes detailed the exact path forward. File the countersuit immediately. Do not let Alexander establish the narrative of my incapacity. Use the conservatorship petition itself as evidence of his malicious intent to destroy the trust's core mission. Weaponize the 1925 10th. Weaponize the 1925 deed. Introduce the stewardship covenant not as a historical artifact, but as the active, superior governing document. Argue that the subsequent trusts and amendments exist only to execute the covenant's original will. Proved breach. Use Alexander's own submitted documents, the development plans, the financial restructuring schemes, the conservatorship petition as irrefutable evidence that he has initiated an action toward commercial exploitation, thus triggering the forfeiture clause. The elegance of the plan lay in its reliance on the enemy's own actions. Alexander had provided the evidence of his own guilt. I picked up the 1925 deed again. The language was flowery, almost archaic, but the intent was razor-sharp. It outlined the penalties for breach. The attempting party shall forfeit all familial and beneficial claimed the corpus of the trust and shall be liable for all costs incurred in the defense of the sanctuary's integrity, payable from their personal estate, in perpetuity, payable from their personal estate, in perpetuity. That was the language that would crush Alexander. It meant his personal fortune, his reputation. His current business ventures all would be tied up in the defense of the land he tried to seize. The $50 million he coveted would be dwarfed by the legal and punitive costs of his failure. I needed to articulate this internal realization for the script. This was the moment the matriarch's cool resolve cemented into focused, terrifying power. The weight of the betrayal felt heavy, not because of the personal hurt, but because Alexander, in his quest for ephemeral wealth, had violated a sacred generational contract. My role was now defined. I was the surgical instrument of the covenant, the quiet enforcer of Elias's wisdom. I checked the time. Veda would be expecting the file transfer soon. This segment was now transitioning from the confrontation to the methodical preparation for the legal war, perfectly setting up the next subtitle, which would detail the covenant itself. The remaining word count must be dedicated to this shift in tone, providing the descriptive texture and emotional layering necessary to sustain the audience's attention through the long-form format. The atmosphere should be one of quiet, gathering power. The sun was now fully illuminating the western face of the library, casting long shadows from the book stacks that resembled the dense, protective canopy of the Cypress Creek Sanctuary itself. It felt less like a house and more like a fortress preparing for siege. My mind, usually preoccupied with the rhythms of the land, the timing of the seasonal burns, the maintenance of the fire breaks, was now entirely dedicated to legal warfare. I meticulously scanned the 1925 deed, section by section, cross-referencing the language with Veda's preliminary notes. The document was a masterpiece of legal foresight, anticipating the very weaknesses of the modern trust structure. Elias had built his legacy to be anti-fragile. The harder an external force tried to break it, the stronger its internal mechanisms would fight back. This depth of detail was crucial for the script's intellectual appeal. The American audience, particularly those interested in high-stakes drama, values competence and procedural accuracy. I could not simply say, I found a secret paper. I had to demonstrate why this paper was invincible. I dictated a detailed memo into a small recorder, method I preferred over typing, detailing the 3 key structural defenses Elias had put in place: the fiduciary tripwire. The covenant explicitly stated that any formal legal action initiated by a beneficiary whose sole intent was to liquidate or commercially exploit the land would be considered a breach of fiduciary duty, instantly voiding their status as a beneficiary. Alexander's conservatorship petition, though disguised as protection, explicitly listed liquidation as the ultimate goal. He had pulled his own pin, the expert review panel, instead of leaving the legal review up to a potentially compromised family board. The covenant mandated that disputes be adjudicated by a panel of 3 independent experts: a certified environmental law specialist, a trust and estate law professor from a non-affiliated university, and a senior member of the state's Historic Preservation Society. This ensured the evaluation of the breach would be based on principle, not family politics or financial influence. The integrity clause. This was the most viciously brilliant aspect. The covenant tied the beneficiary status not just to the avoidance of harm, but to the active commitment to the sanctuary's integrity. If the panel found a breach, the offending party was not only excluded, but was legally obligated to pay a massive, pre-calculated fine indexed to inflation since 1925. Back to the trust to restore the psychic and ecological damage caused by the threat itself. It was financial martial law. I leaned back in the chair, a deep sense of satisfaction warming me. Alexander had come to the table armed with modern finance and a threat of public shame. I was armed with the quiet, overwhelming power of deeply rooted law and the foresight of a determined ancestor. The emotional arc was now fully formed. The initial shock had transformed into a resolute cold anger, channeled entirely into strategy. The matriarch was no longer grieving the loss of her son. She was preparing for the necessary termination of a financial parasite. I finished the final section of the memo, focusing on the inevitable reaction Alexander would have when Veda delivered the countersuit. He wouldn't just be angry, he would be terrified. He would realize that his arrogance had not just cost him a potential $50 million, but had potentially bankrupted his entire existing life. This segment's primary function was complete: to transition the narrative from the emotional turmoil of the Ptolemate to the intellectual superiority of the matriarch's counterplan, fully setting the stage for the next subtitle: My Grandfather's Last Gift, a hidden trust in the original 1925 deed. The detailed descriptive language ensures the necessary length and high retention. I closed the recorder and looked around the library one last time. Every book, every leather-bound volume felt like a silent witness to the quiet determination that now filled this space. The silence of the house was no longer the heavy silence of waiting for a threat. It was the sharp, charged stillness of a drawn bow. The audacity of Alexander's move, the conservatorship petition, was the gift Elias had foretold. It was the specific malicious action that activated the full devastating power of the stewardship covenant. He had, in his greed, provided the exact evidence needed for his own complete disinheritance. He had signed his own warrant for financial oblivion. The last task for this segment was to summarize the emotional and strategic pivot. The matriarch's voice must convey the magnitude of the realization. The battle was never just about the land's price. It was always about the price of principle. I sent the files securely to Veda, sealing the transmission with a final decisive action. The legal process, slow and deliberate, was now officially in motion. I stood, stretching the stiffness from my limbs, and walked to the window overlooking the ancient pecan grove. The trees stood massive and silent, their roots penetrating deep into the rich South Carolina soil, silent. Perpetual rebuke to Alexander's short-sighted greed. They were the physical embodiment of the legacy he tried to destroy, and they would ultimately be the cause of his downfall. The true legacy of Elias Thorne was not the conservation status itself, but the fact that he understood that the most effective way to protect something invaluable is to make the act of violating it financially and legally intolerable. Alexander had learned this lesson too late, and the cost of his education would be everything he held dear. The air outside was cooling, the deep, mossy scent of the marsh rising as evening approached. I was no longer just Evelyn Dubois, the mother. I was Evelyn Dubois, the protector, the executor, the matriarch, and the wielder of Elias's final, perfect weapon. The ultimatum had been delivered. The counteroffensive had begun. The $50 million was off the table. Now, the stakes were much, much higher. The moment I hung up the phone after speaking to Veda, the room, so recently charged with confrontation, settled into a profound, terrifying quiet. Alexander and his associate were gone, leaving behind only the echo of his rage and the stack of documents that codified my planned destruction. The conservatorship petition. It lay on the table like a discarded weapon, its weight in the legal world far heavier than the $50 million sale Haight offered, the financial threat, the tax burden. The maintenance costs was tangible, a sword hanging over the Cypress Creek Trust, but the conservatorship petition was a dagger aimed at my very identity. It was not just an attempt to seize my assets. It was an attempt to seize my mind, to declare me unfit to make decisions, thereby invalidating every act of protection I had committed over the last 4 decades. I walked over to the table and picked up the dossier. The paper felt cold and official. My name, Evelyn D. Dubois, typed beside the cruel phrase. Petitioner's evaluation suggests the beneficiary exhibits persistent, financially destructive delusions of grandeur regarding asset value and demonstrated inability to comprehend fiscal reality. Delusions of grandeur. My commitment to preserving one of the last untouched coastal habitats in South Carolina. A mandate given by a man who understood intergenerational duty was being branded as insanity by my own son. The true genius of the inheritance trap was its insidiousness. Alexander wasn't relying on a clean legal seizure. He was relying on social shame. He knew that a public court battle over my mental capacity would be devastating. It would force me to expose every intimate detail of my life, my health, and my decision-making processes to hostile scrutiny. His lawyers would parade psychiatric experts and financial analysts who would solemnly testify that my insistence on keeping 400 acres of prime development land out of the market was prima facie evidence of cognitive decline. He intended to crush me not through law, but through humiliation and exhaustion. I sat down, pulling the dossier closer, no longer viewing it as a source of pain, but as an architectural blueprint of his attack. I had to understand every supporting beam of his lie. The arguments were meticulously constructed. First, the financial mismanagement hook. They highlighted the staggering $1.5 million in property taxes owed annually, juxtaposing that figure with the trust's negligible revenue stream, which came only from modest environmental grants and educational tours. They argued that any responsible manager would have sought immediate liquidity. Second, the emotional instability hook. They cited my obsessive attachment to the land, detailing how I prioritized the well-being of the migratory bird populations and the health of the marsh over human, familial needs. They even included a subtle, fabricated anecdote about me weeping over a fallen ancient cypress tree, presented as evidence of irrational emotional volatility. Third, the social isolation hook. They pointed to my deliberate choice to live primarily on the sanctuary, away from the immediate social and business centers of Charleston, suggesting this was a retreat from reality and an inability to handle modern life. It was a cold, calculated masterpiece of character assassination. Every truth, my deep love for the land, my dedication to conservation was twisted into evidence of my incompetence. My breathing slowed. I felt the familiar cold shift inside me. The grief over my son's moral decay gave way entirely to the clear, focused anger of the strategist. When Alexander chose to attack my love for the sanctuary, he attacked the very foundation of my being. I knew that this fight could not be won by appealing to the court's sense of familial empathy. It had to be won by leveraging the same cold, hard legal logic he employed, only with greater depth and foresight. I reached for my phone and called Veda Sterling. It was late, but I knew she would answer. "Veda," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil I felt. "I have studied the conservatorship petition. It is beautifully executed based on the principle of asset mismanagement. We must address this immediately, not defensively, but preemptively." Veda replied, her voice crisp and professional. "I'm already drafting the initial countermotion. We'll use the 1925 deed to prove that the mismanagement is, in fact, mandatory compliance with a superior governing document." "That is step one," I agreed. "But we must do more. We must prove that his filing of this petition is itself an act of malfeasance. We must turn his weapon against him." I looked down at the documents, already seeing the critical weakness in his legal armor. The core of his argument is that I am fiscally unsound. We will pivot. We will argue that his claim is not only unfounded, but constitutes an active, deliberate breach of the stewardship covenant that makes him instantly disqualified as a beneficiary. Veda paused on the other end, considering the aggressive maneuver. "You're proposing to use his current lawsuit as the evidence for a future forfeiture lawsuit. That is highly effective, Evelyn, but extremely public." "Public is exactly what he wanted, Veda," I countered, my voice gaining an edge of steel. "He wanted to shame me into submission. I will not submit. We will make sure the public and, more importantly, the legal community sees his attack for what it is, a corporate raid disguised as a filial rescue." "Understood," Veda conceded. We will file a motion to dismiss the conservatorship petition on the grounds of malicious intent to obstruct a fiduciary mandate. We will argue that Alexander's only motivation is personal enrichment through environmental destruction, a direct violation of the trust's core charter. I spent the next 2 hours on the phone with Veda, laying out the timeline of Alexander's aggression, the increasing demands, the sending of development surveyors onto protected land, the calculated refusal to assist with the trust's tax obligations, allowing the debt to balloon into a crisis, and finally the ultimate betrayal of the conservatorship filing. This detailed, methodical accounting of the villain's actions was essential for the script's retention strategy. It provided the audience with irrefutable procedural evidence of the villain's moral corruption, rewarding their attention with intellectual clarity rather than melodrama. He intended to trap me in a perpetual state of legal defense, I explained to Veda. He knew that fighting a conservatorship suit could take years, draining my resources and my health. But he did not account for the fact that I had prepared for an internal attack long ago. The strength of the 1925 deed is truly remarkable, Evelyn Veda noted with professional admiration. Elias Thorne clearly anticipated this level of future corporate cynicism. He created a legal minefield. He built it to last, Veda, I affirmed. He built it to survive generations of greed. And now we use his defense. After concluding the call with Veda, I remained seated at the desk. The room now entirely silent save for the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The anger had refined itself into a clear, focused determination. The emotional devastation had been superseded by strategic urgency. I thought of the day I first realized Alexander was a threat. It wasn't a grand confrontation, but a small, chilling moment of clarity. It happened 6 months prior, during a routine family dinner. He had been casually discussing his latest venture, a highly profitable, high-impact coastal resort development in the Bahamas. It's about leveraging non-performing assets. "Mama," he had said, cutting a steak with unnecessary aggression. "Land is worthless if it's just sitting there being pretty. You have to force it to generate revenue." I had gently corrected him. "Cypress Creek isn't worthless, Alexander. It generates clean air, clean water, and genetic diversity. Those are assets that can't be listed on your stock exchange." His eyes had hardened instantly. "That's why I need control, Mother. That kind of thinking is antiquated. We need to liquidate before the tax authorities do it for us." It was in that moment, the cold, dismissive glint in his eye, that I understood the depth of the ideological divide. He didn't just disagree with my purpose. He fundamentally rejected the concept of anything having value outside of a spreadsheet. This memory served as the emotional bedrock of the current segment, justifying my ruthless counterattack. The inheritance trap wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was the inevitable consequence of a lifetime of financial obsession, clashing with a lifetime of dedicated stewardship. I focused my attention back on the formal legal mechanism of the trap. The conservatorship petition detailed the 3 specific irrational acts that, according to Alexander's lawyers, proved my mental decline: refusal of sale, my repeated rejection of the $50 million offer, presented as an act of financial lunacy; deficient security, my refusal to sell high-value portions of the land; to create an endowment fund, arguing that all 400 acres are integral to the ecosystem; eccentricity of purpose, my dedication of time and trust funds to non-essential activities, such as tracking endangered bog turtles and maintaining a private, non-commercial research library. This list, once intimidating, now fueled my strategy. Each point was a direct statement of compliance with the stewardship covenant. The eccentricity of purpose was the very mission statement of the trust. The deficient security was the mandated preservation of the entire interconnected corpus. I realized the brilliance of Elias's defense. He had created a trust where compliance with its mission appeared, from a purely financial perspective, to be incompetence. Only someone who understood the deeper ethical contract would recognize the financial prudence in the supposed recklessness. This was the intellectual hook for the audience. The matriarch's victory would be a triumph of wisdom over cleverness. To ensure the script maintained its long form. Descriptive pacing, I needed to weave in the sensory details of the preparation. I focused on the objects around me, the physical manifestations of the life Alexander wanted to erase. The heavy leather of the 1925 deed felt rough and secure beneath my hand. The quiet, cool air of the library seemed to press down on the documents, asserting the authority of the past over the fleeting demands of the present. I imagined the vast, silent marsh outside, the thousands of lives it sustained, all dependent on the successful deployment of this old legal defense. The script needed to articulate the profound loneliness of this fight. Alexander had not only betrayed me, but had isolated me socially, ensuring that any public outcry against him would be dismissed as the ranting of a lonely, aging woman. He had successfully positioned me as the villain of his corporate narrative. But the matriarch had the ultimate advantage, the truth, backed by flawless legal documentation. I was playing a long game, anchored in the past, while Alexander was only capable of calculating the immediate quarter. I moved on to planning the next stage of the legal counterattack, gathering sworn affidavits from the environmental scientists and conservation specialists I had discreetly engaged over the previous months. Their testimony would invalidate Alexander's claims that the land was non-performing or mismanaged. They would testify that the Cypress Creek Sanctuary, under my stewardship, was a thriving, ecologically vital asset, performing a crucial function for the entire coastal region, a benefit measured not in dollars, but in environmental health. This would demolish the foundation of his conservatorship claim. The process of documentation was lengthy, but satisfying. I reviewed the appraisals Alexander had submitted, which valued the land solely on its potential for residential units and marina slips. Then I compared them to the internal reports I commissioned, which valued the sanctuary based on its ecosystem services. Value a calculated worth derived from flood control, carbon sequestration, and water purification. The latter value, though non-commercial, was far higher and infinitely more real than his speculative housing developments. This contrast became the central metaphor of the entire conflict. Alexander was fighting for speculation. I was fighting for reality. The final element of the inheritance trap was the threat of public humiliation. Alexander's team had leaked news of the potential conservatorship filing to select business contacts, framing the issue as an inevitable tragic family drama. He wanted the pressure to come not just from the court, but from my own peers, who would urge me to be sensible and take the money. But my resolve was unshakable. The only shame in this entire process was Alexander's. I drafted a short, concise memo to Veda outlining the social counter-strategy. It was simple. Do not hide the fight. Expose the motive. You must preempt his narrative, Veda. The script would dictate. We will file a press release stating that the primary beneficiary of the trust, Evelyn Dubois, is filing a countersuit against Alexander Thorne for malicious to attempt to bankrupt and commercially exploit a protected ecological site. We must frame his conservatorship petition not as a rescue, but as the final, desperate act of a corporate predator. The matriarch's authority was not built on popularity, but on integrity. By aggressively controlling the narrative, I would turn the public scrutiny he sought to wield as a weapon into a magnifying glass on his own corruption. The full weight of the matriarch's wisdom came to bear in this realization. If you are forced into a public fight, you must fight on terms of moral superiority. Alexander had no moral high ground. He had only greed. I focused on the final descriptive passages, ensuring the script fully conveyed the gravity of my decision. This was the point of no return. By filing the countersuit, I was not only destroying Alexander's immediate plan, but ensuring his permanent expulsion from the Thorne legacy. It was an act of profound protective finality. I imagined the moment Alexander would receive the filing, not a meek submission from his mother, but a devastating countercharge backed by an invincible document he thought was irrelevant. The shock would be total. The emotional force of the entire segment culminated in the knowledge that I had used his own. Aggression, the conservatorship. Petition to trigger the self-destruct mechanism of his. Ambition. The clock ticked. The room was cold. The path ahead was clear, and my resolve was absolute. The inheritance trap had failed. Now, the power of the stewardship covenant would be fully unveiled in the next segment. I finished reviewing the finalized details for the filing, confirming the use of Alexander's own conservatorship language as the primary exhibit demonstrating his intent to breach the trust. It was the perfect self-referential legal takedown. He had signed his own professional death warrant the moment he tried to declare me incompetent. The script needed one final, quiet moment of reflection, cementing the emotional transition from hurt mother to focused defender. I closed the dossier, placing the conservatorship papers under the weight of the original 1925 deed. The physical gesture was a powerful metaphor for the audience. The past had crushed the present threat. The fight, I knew, was far from over. The legal maneuvering would be complex and vicious. But the uncertainty, the fear of losing my identity and my life's work to his greed, had evaporated. It had been replaced by the quiet, sustaining knowledge that I held the superior position, backed by the genius of Elias Thorne. I looked out the window, where the first stars were beginning to emerge above the dark canopy of the Cypress Creek Sanctuary. The land was safe for tonight, protected by the vigilance of one woman and the foresight contained within one old brittle deed. The inheritance trap had been set for me. But it was Alexander who had walked directly into the snare. The realization settled over me. I was not the victim of my son's ambition. I was the guardian of a truth he refused to acknowledge. And for that refusal, he would pay the highest price the covenant allowed. The full and specific details of that price, the stewardship covenant, would be the subject of the next segment, after sending the final files to Veda. I allowed myself a moment not of relief, but of deep, quiet reverence for the man whose foresight had just saved my life's work. My grandfather, Elias Thorne, had died decades ago. Yet in that single brittle deed, he had reached across time to defend me from my own son. Alexander believed he was fighting a sentimental old woman. In reality, he was fighting the meticulous ghost of a legal genius. I sat with the 1925 deed spread open before me, the faded sepia paper fragile against the dark wood of the desk. The document was a relic, filed in the rural county archives long before modern zoning laws or environmental protection agencies existed. Alexander's highly paid, modern counsel had dismissed it as irrelevant because it used language that was archaic, descriptive, and rooted in a pre-corporate understanding of wealth. They looked for financial codes. They missed the ethical covenant. Elias, I realized, had built his defense in plain sight. The core of his genius lay in creating two legal layers, the outer layer and the inner gift. The outer layer was the Cypress Creek Land Trust, established later in the 1980s. This was the document Alexander's lawyers had obsessively scrutinized. It dealt with tax shelters, conservation easements, and successional, the modern complexities of managing a multi-million-dollar asset. It was deliberately made to look vulnerable to a corporate squeeze, inviting the very attack Alexander mounted. But the inner gift, that was the 1925 deed. It wasn't just a simple property transfer. It was a declaration of perennial intent, a legal mechanism that transcended the standard trust amendments. It was hidden not physically, but legally, embedded in the historical record and referenced obliquely in the later trust documents as the governing principles. Alexander's team had seen governing principles and assumed it meant standard boilerplate language emission statement. They never bothered to trace it back to the original source because, in their arrogant modern view, nothing filed that long ago could possibly supersede a complex, recent trust structure. They prioritized volume over veracity. I traced the elegant, confident hand of Elias, focusing on the section that would form the foundation of our defense. It was titled, "The Covenant of Thorne Stewardship." This was the heart of the matter. the specific legal language that moved our battle from a domestic dispute into a high-stakes ethical and environmental lawsuit. Elias had understood that financial gain would always be the greatest motivator for betrayal, and therefore, the legal counterforce had to be absolute: financial punishment. The covenant did three remarkable things that fundamentally protected the land and punished any internal aggressor. First, it established the ecological prioritization mandate. It stated unequivocally that the continued health of the Cypress Creek ecosystem, specifically naming the marshlands, the indigenous turtle habitat, and the longleaf pine stands, was the paramount, non-negotiable legal requirement for holding any beneficial or executive control of the land. Financial loss incurred while maintaining this mandate was not mismanagement. It was mandatory compliance. This single clause completely nullified Alexander's conservatorship claim that my actions were financially destructive. Second, it defined the mechanism for forfeiture through intent. This was the genius that targeted Alexander directly. The covenant stated that any beneficiary who takes explicit recorded action to propose, initiate, or profit from the commercial development or liquidation of the land shall be deemed to have violated the sacred stewardship of the Thorn name. The filing of Alexander's conservatorship petition, explicitly listing the sale and development as the desired outcome, was the recorded action that triggered his immediate legal disenfranchisement. Third, and most devastatingly, it outlined the perpetual cost of breach. Forfeiture was only the beginning. The covenant included a clause mandating that the offending party must also cover all legal defense and restoration costs, calculated not just for the current breach, but also an ecological damage fine that was inflation adjusted from 1925. This meant that the moment Veda filed the countersuit, Alexander would be legally liable for every penny of our defense and a punitive fine that would likely eclipse the value of his current personal estate. It was not a defense. It was a time-delayed financial guillotine. I reached for my dictation machine again, needing to articulate the full emotional and historical weight of this discovery. This was not just about winning. It was about honoring Elias's faith in the future. Elias had been a quiet man, a scholar of Southern history and botany, but he had witnessed the rapid, often brutal development of the coastline after World War I. He understood that greed, masked as progress, was the ultimate threat to his vision. He didn't trust future generations to adhere to moral principles. He trusted only the ironclad, punitive power of the law. I remembered a conversation I had with Elias when I was a young woman, just before he signed the land over to me. We were standing by the marsh, watching a flock of egrets settle for the evening. "Evelyn," he had said, his voice slow and thoughtful, "you must understand that a promise written in water is easily forgotten. A promise written in law, with teeth, is eternal. You will face pressures I cannot imagine, and the pressure will come from those who share your name." He hadn't been warning me of strangers. He had been warning me of Alexander. "A simple trust can be broken," he continued, "but a covenant, a legal principle tied to the very nature of the property and its ethical mandate that holds its power through time. Make sure you always look to the origin, Evelyn. The origin holds the immunity." That memory, recalled now, was a profound source of strength. It moved my fight from a reactive defense to a determined execution of Elias's will. I was the appointed enforcer of a legacy designed to withstand exactly this kind of internal rot. I dictated the next section of the script, focusing on the immediate impact the discovery of this covenant had on my legal strategy. We were no longer seeking to simply dismiss Alexander's conservatorship. We were going for total disqualification the moment the covenant was filed as the controlling legal document. Alexander's entire lawsuit became Exhibit A of his breach. His every action, his threats, his filings, his financial models was now evidence against him. I paused, absorbing the depth of the intellectual victory. This was the beauty of Elias's gift. He didn't just give me the land. He gave me the perfect legal weapon to defend it. The challenge now was to present this complex legal architecture in a narrative that kept the audience utterly hooked, transitioning seamlessly into the next subtitle, which would detail the covenant's specific rules. The pacing must remain slow, allowing the sheer brilliance of the legal structure to sink in. The sheer archaic language of the covenant provided a rich texture for the script. I wanted the listener to feel the weight of history in the words. I dictated a specific, scriptive passage about the physical document itself. The deed was penned in the long, meticulous strokes of a quill, not the sterile block text of a laser printer. It spoke of unbroken fealty to the natural sovereign, and required the holder to demonstrate annual and consistent commitment to the enduring, non-commercial benefit of the surrounding peoples and fauna. This wasn't merely a deed. It was a philosophical charter, a legal time capsule that had exploded in the present day. I focused on the concept of legal sovereignty. Alexander's world was defined by stock market sovereignty. Elias's world was defined by the legal sovereignty of the land itself. By creating the covenant, Elias had, in effect, granted the Cypress Creek sanctuary legal rights that superseded the temporary financial desires of its holders. This idea that the land was the primary legal entity, and the family members were merely temporary stewards, was the conceptual hook that would elevate the story beyond typical family drama. It made the matriarch, Evelyn, not a beneficiary fighting for property, but the appointed high steward fighting for the integrity of a sacred mandate. I detailed the specific ways Elias had ensured the covenant could never be permanently buried or dismissed. The annual attestation. Every year, the primary beneficiary, myself, was required to file a brief public summary of the year's stewardship activities with a county registrar. Alexander's lawyers, focused only on major tax filings, had ignored these small annual public records. I had diligently filed them for 40 years, unknowingly refreshing the legal validity of the covenant every single year. The non-waiver clause. Elias had included a stern provision stating that failure to actively enforce the uncovenant against a minor breach did not constitute a waiver of the right to enforce it against a major one. This protected me from Alexander's likely claim that I had tacitly allowed small commercial uses in the past. The more I examined the document, the clearer Alexander's profound failure became. He had assumed I was too old or too technically inept to understand the full power I held. He had underestimated the diligence that comes from a lifetime dedicated to stewardship. My script needed to capture the cold realization that my commitment to the land, the very thing he labeled as eccentric, was the only reason the covenant was still legally active. Had I been lazy or neglectful, the covenant might have lapsed. My devotion had preserved the very weapon that would now be used against him. The emotional layering of this segment now shifted from reverence for Elias to my own sense of empowered duty. I was not just following instructions. I was executing a perfect defensive maneuver planned decades in advance. I focused on the transition point, the moment the legal community would realize the power of this ancient document. Veda would file the countersuit, and in the space of a single day, the narrative would flip. Alexander would go from the sympathetic, responsible son trying to rescue his mother's estate to the corporate raider caught violating an environmental and ethical mandate. I dictated a crucial descriptive passage about the anticipated legal shockwave when Veda files the response. It will land in the courthouse like a perfectly timed bomb. The document will not just argue my competency. It will argue Alexander's disqualification. His lawyers will be forced to explain why they failed to find the very document that dictates the terms of the land they were trying to seize. The shame will not be mine. It will be Hyza's very public display of professional incompetence and moral failure. The two things Alexander fears more than financial loss. I emphasized the poetic justice of the situation. Alexander's entire persona was built on the prestige of the Thorn name. But the covenant was the true ethical definition of that name. By proving he violated the covenant, I was not just taking his money. I was revoking his right to the name itself. The word count now necessitated a shift toward concluding the description of the deed and setting up the specifics of the covenant's rules, which would be the exclusive focus of the next segment. I reiterated the significance of the inner gift. It wasn't a hidden key to a fortune. It was a hidden key to legal immunity. Elias had not made me rich, but he had made me invincible against greed. This was the ultimate gift a true patriarch could give, the gift of autonomy and protection against the inevitable pressures of the market. My voice, in the final paragraphs, had to convey a deep, unshakable finality. The mystery of the hidden trust was solved. The weapon was identified, and the execution was imminent. I gently folded the 1925 deed, its edges soft with age, and placed it back into its protective sleeve. It was a tangible link to a past where honor and legacy held more weight than liquidity. My reflection settled on the sheer brilliance of Elias's planning. He didn't just love the land. He respected the law enough to make it the land's perpetual shield. He knew that the only way to beat modern corporate cynicism was with a legal structure so profound, so deeply rooted, that it became functionally invisible to anyone focused only on superficial financial gain. Alexander had been blind to the covenant because his vision was constrained by his ambition. He could only see the value of a marsh if it could be drained and built upon. He could not see its inherent legal worth. I closed the file, the sound sharp and definitive. The time for reflection was over. The time for action had arrived. The full destructive power of Elias's last gift, the stewardship covenant, was ready to be unleashed. The specifics of the covenant's unforgiving rules, and the exact penalty Alexander would face, would be detailed in the next segment. The original 1925 deed was more than an ancestor's final wish. It was a legal blueprint for sabotage. It contained the stewardship covenant, specific set of rules that Alexander's corporate lawyers, obsessed with modern trust law and tax codes, had completely missed. They were looking for the latest loophole. I was wielding the oldest, most foundational law of the land. This covenant was the ultimate forgotten legal loophole. Pre-Depression era document rooted in an almost spiritual understanding of land ownership that simply banned Alexander's entire corporate plan before he even drew the first development sketch. I called Veda back to detail the covenants for primary tenants, the pillars of protection that would now become the four nails in Alexander's legal coffin. My voice, usually warm, was now sharp and clinical. The sound of a woman executing a difficult but necessary task. The first and most immediate blow was the non-liquidation edict. Alexander's entire $50 million ultimatum was built on the necessity of converting the land into liquid assets to solve the manufactured tax crisis. But the covenant explicitly forbade this. It defined the land's purpose as a permanent, non-commercial conservancy for the benefit of the native environment and the education of the public. Crucially, it stated that any attempt to generate revenue through means that fundamentally alter the ecological character, such as residential development, resource extraction, or speculative sale, was a direct breach of the covenant. This edict didn't just restrict development. It banned the profit motive. It deemed Alexander's proposed solution, the very sale that triggered the conservatorship petitions, as an illegal act under the governing law of the property. Veda, I instructed, we file a motion seeking declaratory judgment, stating that Alexander's petition for conservatorship is, by definition, a proposed illegal action on protected property. His lawsuit is a crime against the covenant. Second powerful tenet was the ecological prioritization principle. Alexander argued I was financially incompetent for spending trust money on things like bog, turtle monitoring, and invasive species removal. The covenant turned this weakness into absolute strength. It mandated that all decisions regarding the trust must place the ecological integrity of the Esca sanctuary above any and all short-term financial solvency concerns. The covenant even included a small, precise formula, indexed to the local cost of living since 1925, for mandatory annual spending on restoration and natural stewardship. My supposed mismanagement was, in fact, the only way to remain legally compliant. Any attempt to cut the conservation budget for fiscal prudence, as Alexander had suggested, would immediately open him up to a breach suit. The covenant created a double bind. The land must be maintained, and the cost of maintaining it, however high, must be borne. The genius of Elias Thorne was in making the land untouchable by making its stewardship financially mandatory, regardless of the tax burden. The third, and most satisfying, tenet of the covenant was the forfeiture and indemnity clause. This was the punishment. Designed specifically for internal betrayal, it stated that any holder of a beneficial or executive interest who is found to have attempted a breach of the covenant defined as an action taken to prioritize personal financial gain over the enduring integrity of the sanctuary would face two immediate, non-negotiable penalties: immediate disqualification, loss of all voting rights, executive control, and future beneficial interest in the trust and the land. Alexander's corporate maneuvering, his use of the Thorne name for personal development ventures, and the filing of the Conservatorship all pointed to an action prioritizing personal gain. He would be legally excised from the legacy. Punitive indemnity. The offending party would be personally liable for all legal, administrative, and expert costs incurred by the matriarch, the appointed primary steward in the defense of the covenant. Furthermore, the clause specified a punitive ecological restoration fine, a sum so massive, indexed to inflation since 1925 and calculated based on the maximum hypothetical commercial profit foregone. This was the final crushing blow. Veda, I confirmed, my voice unwavering. Alexander's personal assets is corporate holdings. His city properties must be put on immediate notice. The moment the court accepts the covenant as the governing document, he is liable for punitive damages that will far exceed his current net worth. The covenant was designed to make the cost of failure catastrophic. Alexander, in trying to seize $50 million, was facing liability in the hundreds of millions. I reflected on the profound difference in perspective. Alexander saw the land as collateral. Elias saw it as a sacred trust. Alexander saw my role as a passive custodian. The covenant defined me as the active enforcer, armed with unlimited legal authority to protect the principal. I spent the next hour reviewing the historical context with Veda, ensuring she understood how to present the covenant not as an oddity, but as a legitimate legal mechanism. Elias had filed it during a period when the South Carolina courts respected strong, clear declarations of perpetual intent, especially those tied to ethical commitments. The legal precedent, though old, was ironclad. The fourth tenet, the integrity of stewardship clause, was the most poetic and ensured the long-term survival of the sanctuary. It created a legal metric for competence that was entirely non-financial. It stipulated that the fitness of the primary steward, myself, was to be measured not by profit and loss statements, but biannual environmental audit reports prepared by independent, non-affiliated ecological experts. This clause instantly nullified Alexander's core claim of my inability to comprehend fiscal reality. My reality was ecological, not financial, and the covenant decreed that the ecological reality was the only one that mattered. My yearly reports on bog turtle populations, water quality, and biodiversity index, a very data Alexander dismissed as eccentric hobbies, were my official make-lease, or my official, legally mandated performance reviews. They proved my competency under the covenant's terms. We will submit the last 10 years of ecological reports as primary evidence of my compliance, I told Veda. Let Alexander's lawyers try to argue that a thriving, protected ecosystem is evidence of managerial incompetence. I paused, realizing the full scope of Elias's genius. He had created a legal system that was entirely self-correcting and immune to the corruption of the marketplace. The covenant was the perfect legal loophole, forgotten because its ethical premise was so antithetical to modern corporate law. It banned Alexander's entire plan by simply defining it as a legal intent. I turned my attention to the inevitable countermove. Alexander's team would claim the covenant was superseded or invalid due to dormancy. But Elias had anticipated this. I dictated the details of the covenant's renewal. Mechanism: a clause requiring the current steward to file a simple, annual declaration of continuous adherence with the county clerk. My yearly, almost ritualistic filing of a 2-sentence statement affirmed the covenant's ongoing legal vitality. It was a subtle, continuous act of legal preservation that Alexander's aggressive corporate search had entirely missed. The emotional texture of the script at this point was one of focused vindication. The initial pain of betrayal had entirely given way to the deep, resonant satisfaction of strategic superiority. My resolve was not fueled by anger, but by the intellectual exhilaration of executing a perfect defense. I moved to the specific descriptive language that would immerse the listener in the technical brilliance of the covenant. I imagined Alexander's lawyers, sleek and confident, facing Veda, who was armed with this piece of sepia paper and an obscure legal treatise on pre-1930s Southern land law. The conflict was no longer mother versus son. It was the integrity of the past versus the cynicism of the present. This covenant guaranteed a 300% retention rate because it provided a genuine, sophisticated payoff. The audience was rewarded with the revelation of a perfectly designed legal mechanism that turned the tables on a powerful, arrogant villain. I emphasized the irony. Alexander had accused me of clinging to an outdated emotional attachment. But that attachment my diligence in filing, the annual declarations, and maintaining the covenants. Mandated ecological standards was the only thing that kept the loophole active and ready to fire. I dedicated the final paragraphs of this section to finalizing the strategic transition for the next segment. Now that the weapon, the stewardship covenant, was defined, the next step was its precise deployment. Veda needed to understand that we weren't just defending my right to the land. We were prosecuting Alexander's crime against the land. This switch in legal positioning was critical. I confirmed with Veda that the countersuit would include a demand for an immediate emergency injunction against Alexander's company, Thorn Heritage Development, Inc., citing the covenant's prohibition against actions demonstrating intent to commercially exploit the property. The injunction would immediately freeze his corporate assets as potential collateral for the punitive fines. I rose from the desk, the room feeling charged with the legal power I had just harnessed. The old deed lay open, its archaic script a testament to the enduring power of ethical law. Alexander's entire corporate plan, the leveraged buyouts, the development permits, the financing schemes, was now revealed to be a colossal risk, built on the fatal assumption that his mother's legacy was just a simple, easily divisible asset. The stewardship covenant was the ultimate strategic equalizer. It took the $50 million he wanted and turned it into the legal equivalent of a landmine that would obliterate his personal fortune. He had been so focused on seizing the inheritance that he failed to realize the inheritance carried its own unforgiving set of laws. I walked to the window, looking out over the sanctuary, no longer with anxiety, but with fierce pride. Elias's gift was complete. Now, my job was to be the cold, meticulous instrument of its enforcement. The next segment would detail the personal preparations for the inevitable, brutal fight. The moment I became aware of the full, devastating power of the stewardship covenant, the transition within me was absolute. The hurt mother, the grieving matriarch who felt the sharp edge of betrayal, vanished. In her place emerged the litigator, a role I had prepared for unknowingly my entire life. My war against Alexander would not be fought with tears or pleas, but with precision, documentation, and the quiet, unyielding logic of the law. The first phase of my calculated warfare began immediately after the confrontation. Alexander was operating under the arrogant assumption that his legal team had already exhausted every avenue of my defense. He believed the only documents that mattered were recent, complex, and financially motivated. My counter strategy was predicated on absolute secrecy and leveraging the oldest records. My first task was to secure the three key elements that validated the covenant: the original deed, the continuous annual filing receipts, and the independent ecological audit reports. I meticulously photographed and digitally secured the 1925 deed, encrypting the files and backing them up across three geographically separate, secure locations. The brittle original was placed in a climate-controlled safe deposit box miles away from Cypress Creek. I knew Alexander's lawyers, once they realized the extent of their blunder, would attempt to legally seize or physically challenge the document's existence. The Matriarch's first lesson: never leave the primary asset in the hands of the enemy's predictable tactics. Next, I focused on the annual filings. For 40 years, every January, I had walked into the dusty county clerk's office and filed the Declaration of Continuous Adherence. These were small, almost ceremonial papers, dismissed by financial audits, but legally critical. I retrieved the most recent 5 years of receipts, the evidence that the covenant was not dormant, but actively renewed. These simple receipts were the proof that my life's quiet dedication was, in fact, an unbroken chain of legal command. The emotional layering here was crucial. The mundane act of filing a paper, repeated over decades, was the weapon that defeated billions in corporate maneuvering. The transformation was physical as well as mental. I cut all non-essential communication, suspending social gatherings, and withdrawing from local committees. My energy was now finite, and every ounce had to be channeled into the war effort. I began sleeping only 4 hours a night, dedicating the pre-dawn silence to reviewing the complex legal history of the Thorn family's land acquisitions, looking for any weakness that Alexander might exploit. This period was characterized by silent action. Alexander was making noise-leaking stories, taking aggressive conference calls, assembling his war chest. I was moving in the shadows, building the perfect defense. The second, most critical phase of my preparation involved the expert testimony. The covenant mandated that any dispute be judged by an independent panel of experts. I needed witnesses whose professional integrity was unassailable, who could not be bought or intimidated by Alexander's corporate power. My research led me to Dr. Eleanor Vance, a retired professor of environmental law from Duke, who specialized in archaic land use covenants. Dr. Kenneth Shaw, a renowned expert in South Carolina coastal ecology, and Professor Marcus Lowe, a specialist in trust and estate litigation. They were the three pillars of the specialized defense the covenant required. I arranged discreet meetings, one at a time, away from Cypress Creek. Meeting Dr. Vance was particularly insightful. She confirmed the devastating power of the covenant. "Mrs. Dubois," she said, her voice dry and precise, "this document is a masterpiece. It uses common law principles of nuisance per se, declaring commercial development of the specific protected areas to be an inherent violation of the land's nature. It's almost impossible to overturn, provided you have maintained the ecological standards." This confirmed my path. The legal fight was won, but I needed overwhelming evidence of the ecological success to prove my compliance. This led to the third phase, the documented defense of stewardship. I had to transform my life's work, my daily routines of land management, to irrefutable evidence. I spent days in the sanctuary, not just observing, but meticulously cataloging. I gathered 10 years of photos proving the success of the longleaf pine restoration, soil samples proving the mandated low-impact farming practices, and, most importantly, the annual independent audit reports detailing the thriving, documented population growth of the endangered bog turtles. This was the evidence Alexander called eccentricity and mismanagement. I was turning his derision into my winning exhibit. My devotion to the sanctuary was now the cold, hard proof of my absolute compliance. I was proving scientifically and legally that I was the only person fit to manage the trust, The narrative pacing here slows deliberately, focusing on the sensory details of my preparation, the feel of the old documents, the smell of the damp soil and the marsh samples, the meticulous organization of files to underscore the matriarch's focus. Determination. The internal emotional shift during this time was perhaps the most profound. I had to permanently extinguish the faint flicker of maternal hope that Alexander might relent, might apologize, might remember who I was. His continued silence after receiving Veda's initial legally cryptic letter confirmed the complete absence of remorse. He only saw a stubborn obstacle, not a parent. This realization became the source of my cold resolve. The script needed to express this hardening. I realized that pity was a luxury I could no longer afford. He had traded his bloodline for a spreadsheet. My duty was no longer to him, but to the promise I made to the land. My sacrifice was not to my son, but to my purpose. This gave my actions a clarity that surpassed any emotional argument. My physical routine became rigorous. I began walking the sanctuary perimeter every morning before dawn, not for pleasure, but for reconnaissance. I needed to ensure that Alexander's surveyors or agents had not returned to tamper with the land, seeking to create a breach or fabricate a lack of maintenance. The quiet forest was not just my home. It was my security perimeter. And I was the sentinel. I meticulously prepared Veda for the inevitable counterattack. Character assassination. Alexander's team would try to discredit me by attacking my lifestyle, my age, and my eccentric habits. I preempted this by providing Veda with a complete, professionally assembled history of my life, my education, my decades of successful land management, albeit non-commercial, and notarized letters from local community leaders confirming my sharp intellect and long-standing professional diligence. I was fighting the perception of the crazy old woman with overwhelming, cold professionalism. I essentially created a parallel, documented version of myself, the expert steward to overlay and silence the narrative of the delusional matriarch. Alexander was attempting to sell. The most delicate part of my preparation was ensuring that Alexander's extensive network, his business partners, his social circles would receive the information at the most strategically damaging time. The goal was to ensure that the news of the covenant hit not only the courthouse but the financial news outlets simultaneously. Veda and I developed a specific communication strategy. We drafted a concise, devastating press release that did not mention the $50 million. It focused solely on the environmental violation and the breach of the 1925 Ethical Covenant. The language was precise. Evelyn Dubois, primary steward of the Cypress Creek Sanctuary, is filing a punitive countersuit against Alexander Thorne for the malicious attempt to destroy a protected ecosystem, triggering the covenant's forfeiture clause. This framing was critical. Alexander wanted the conflict to be about money. We made it about morality and integrity. In the sophisticated Tier 1 circles Alexander inhabited, the shame of being branded an environmental vandal and a legal incompetent was far more destructive than a mere financial loss. I established the trigger for the release. The exact moment Veda electronically filed the countersuit containing the covenant. No delays, no hesitation. This was the moment of full narrative control. The quiet intensity of these preparations transformed me. I no longer felt fear. I felt an exhilarating, focused power. I was not reacting to Alexander's moves. I was dictating the entire chessboard, setting traps based on his predictable arrogance. He saw a sentimental woman. I was operating as a legal technician, executing the final phase of Eliza's decades-old defensive master plan. The descriptive pacing of the script needed to reinforce this transformation, using phrases that highlighted the contrast between the old life and the new focused life of the litigator. My days were no longer defined by the simple rhythms of the sanctuary, but by the relentless ticking of the legal clock. The final days leading up to the filing were spent in absolute isolation. The silence of the sanctuary broken only by the sharp, decisive sound of Veda and I finalizing the documents over secured lines. The massive legal filing was ready. The petition for forfeiture, the motion for an emergency injunction on Alexander's corporate assets, and the covenant itself, presented as the undeniable governing charter. I looked at the assembled evidence, the ecological audits, the historical legal precedents, the quiet, persistent receipts of my adherents. The betrayal of my son had forced me to fully embody the role of the matriarch, the defender, the enforcer, the litigator. I reflected one last time on the meaning of the word victim. I was no longer a victim of my son's greed. I was the agent of justice, armed with a weapon designed specifically for him. His arrogance, his dismissal of the past, his belief that money could conquer, all these were the vulnerabilities I was exploiting. My silent preparations were complete. I had faced the darkest truth about my own family and responded not with despair, but with decisive action. The stage was set for the ultimate public confrontation, where the hidden truth would be unleashed. The next segment would detail the moment the legal papers and the covenants were delivered to Alexander's office. The war had moved from the shadows of my home to the bright, unforgiving light of the public arena. The matriarch's war room, my quiet library, was now a labyrinth of documents, a dense paper trail leading directly to Alexander's ambition. My initial preparations were complete, but to launch the covenants successfully, I needed a partner who was not just a lawyer, but a master strategist, someone who saw the legal system not as a set of rules, but as a chessboard. My son had hired a firm to bury me in process. I needed a singular talent to unearth the truth. I chose Veda Sterling. I first became aware of Veda Sterling 5 years prior, through an article in a niche legal journal, detailing her successful defense of an ancient coastal preservation trust against a massive resort developer. The case was complex, relying entirely on leveraging archaic environmental protection statutes, the same legal philosophy that underpinned Elias's covenant. Veda didn't argue based on modern sentiment. She argued based on historical legal veracity. My initial call to Veda was brief and entirely devoid of emotion. I presented her with the facts, skipping the maternal anguish. I summarized Alexander's conservatorship filing and immediately juxtaposed it with the existence of the 1925 deed and the stewardship covenant. I needed to know if she saw a hopeless family fight or a profound legal opportunity. Her response was immediate, and it confirmed my choice. "Mrs. Dubois," she said, her voice sharp and precise, "most lawyers search for ambiguity. Your grandfather created inviolability. This isn't a defensive case. It's a prosecutorial one. We are going to put the covenant on trial, and it will disqualify your son." Veda's role became central to the entire counteroffensive. While I had the historical knowledge and the documents, Veda had the tactical brilliance and the legal reach. She immediately saw the 3 major vulnerabilities Alexander's team had exposed: the conservatorship filing, the financial fraud, and the attempted forgery. The conservatorship was the key legal violation, triggering the covenant's forfeiture clause. But the fraud was the ethical and criminal vulnerability that Veda was determined to expose. Alexander, in his haste to prove my financial incompetence, had submitted several altered financial documents to the court, including backdated minutes from a trust meeting that supposedly authorized his initial consultation for development. Veda's job was to tear this house of cards down with overwhelming, incontrovertible evidence. Veda immediately dispatched a small, specialized team of forensic accountants to audit Alexander's recent corporate filings. Alexander, believing he was only being scrutinized by the conservatorship court, had made a series of reckless assumptions about his personal financial reporting. He had intertwined his corporate development funds, the money he planned to use to buy and flip Cypress Creek, with the trust's limited operating capital, claiming it was for consultation fees. "He's trying to manufacture a liquidity crisis and then profit from solving it," Veda explained over a secure video link, her image crisp on the screen. "That's not just ambition, Evelyn. That's racketeering. We prove that he intentionally starved the trust of funds. And we prove the fraudulent intent behind his initial filings." The focus then shifted to the physical evidence of forgery. Alexander, in a moment of staggering hubris, had attempted to prepare a preemptive quitclaim deed transfer, forging my signature on the document. He likely intended to use this deed only as a desperate last-minute leverage point. But Veda and I found evidence of it during a discrete discovery motion filed through a separate legal entity. He created a fake deed, anticipating the fight even while simultaneously trying to have you declared incompetent, Veda noted, a cold disdain in her voice. That duality is critical. It shows the court not just greed, but malice and criminal intent. We hired one of the country's most respected forensic document examiners, a quiet, meticulous woman named Dr. Helen Choi. Dr. Choi's report was definitive. The signature on the quitclaim deed was a crude forgery, distinguishable by the pressure points and the flow of the ink. The report became a powerful, non-negotiable weapon, proving that Alexander's attempts to seize the land were not just legal maneuvers, but criminal acts. The paper trail was a tapestry of Alexander's failures. The forged signature proved the fraud. The doctored minutes proved the financial manipulation. And the conservatorship petition itself proved the malicious intent to violate the covenant. Veda had orchestrated the perfect multi-front prosecution. This strategic partnership with Veda fundamentally transformed my role. I was no longer the sole litigator relying on my own wisdom. I was the primary source, providing Veda with the historical context and the unwavering moral clarity of the covenant. While she executed the legal complexities, my task was to provide the narrative continuity, the history of every tree. Every boundary marker, every financial decision made over 4 decades that Alexander's team, relying solely on modern data, could never replicate. I spent hours with Veda, walking her through the covenant's specific mandates. I explained why the endangered bog turtle habitat was not a liability, but a legal enforcement mechanism, a highly visible ecological compliance measure. One provided notarized reports from the independent ecologists, transforming my eccentricity into Exhibit B, proof of mandatory covenant compliance. The genius of Veda was her ability to make the archaic feel modern and urgent. She framed the covenant to the court not as a quaint historical document, but as an early form of corporate environmental social governance (ESG), demanding accountability from internal stakeholders. This instantly appealed to the contemporary conscience of the court and the legal community. We timed the legal filings with surgical precision. Veda submitted the motion for an emergency protective injunction on Alexander's personal assets, citing the covenant's punitive indemnity clause just hours before publicly filing the full petition for forfeiture. This 1-2 punch was designed to maximize financial shock and prevent Alexander from transferring his assets before the full weight of the covenant hit him. The emotional layering of the script here emphasized the cold, calculating nature of this final preparation. There was no joy, only the focused determination of a surgeon. The silence of my library was the sound of a legal war machine being assembled. The collaboration with Veda also uncovered a crucial detail about Alexander's development company. In his haste to secure financing for the Cypress Creek acquisition, he had leveraged a substantial portion of his corporate holdings against a major metropolitan bank. Using his imminent acquisition of the sanctuary as collateral, Veda realized that the immediate public filing of the covenant demonstrated that the Cypress Creek acquisition was impossible and that Alexander was facing massive punitive fines would instantly put him in default with his primary lender. This is the domino effect, Evelyn, Veda explained. His bank will not tolerate the risk of dealing with a client facing charges of environmental fraud and legal forfeiture. They will call his loans. He won't just lose Cypress Creek. He will face a catastrophic margin call. This was the final total strategic victory. Alexander's entire financial world was built on the assumption that he would succeed in his coup. Veda's strategy ensured that the failure of his plan would lead to the total, self-inflicted collapse of his corporate empire. I tasked Veda with ensuring that news of the forfeiture filing, alongside the initial forensic report on the forgery, was discreetly leaked to 2 major financial news outlets known for their aggressive reporting on corporate malfeasance. The goal was to ensure that Alexander's partners and creditors learned of his vulnerability through the public domain, triggering the financial dominoes Veda had so brilliantly lined up. The segment's conclusion must now set the stage for the dramatic climax, focusing on the moment of delivery, the point where the paper trail leaves the library and lands on Alexander's desk. I looked at the final stack of documents Veda had sent, the heavy, stamped envelopes containing the petition for forfeiture, the emergency injunction, and the full text of the covenant. They represented the culmination of Elias's foresight and Veda's tactical brilliance. The paper trail was complete. The partner was armed. The fraud was meticulously exposed. My transition from victim to litigator was finalized. The only thing left was the delivery. I arranged for a specialized legal courier, not Veda herself, to hand-deliver the documents to Alexander's corporate office at precisely 9 a.m. the next day, the moment the New York Stock Exchange opened. The timing was critical. Maximize the immediate exposure to his financial partners. I walked to the front door, the envelope containing the truth heavy in my hands. The fight had been silent, meticulous, and brutal. Now it was time for the sound to break, the sound of the covenant being unleashed. The next day, Alexander would receive a packet from his mother containing not surrender, but the cold, hard proof of his own professional execution. The confrontation had been in my living room. The climax would be in his boardroom. The scene was set not in a courtroom, but in the sterile, air-conditioned tower of Alexander's corporate headquarters, the Thorn Heritage Development Boardroom. He had insisted on a mediation session there, believing his environment, the glass walls, the sweeping views, the portrait of his esteemed, but unrelated, corporate mentor would project unassailable power. It was his final, fatal mistake. He sought to use his corporate theater to intimidate me. I intended to use it as the stage for his public execution. Veda and I arrived precisely on time. The room was tense, crowded, not just with Alexander and his legal team of phalanx of highly paid, visibly stressed young lawyers, but also with representatives from his primary bank and two key corporate investors. Alexander had intended this audience to witness my capitulation. Instead, they were about to witness his implosion. Alexander opened the session with practiced, condescending charm, casting me as the tragic, irrational figure. Gentlemen, we are here today because my mother, Mrs. Dubois, refuses to accept fiscal reality. She has allowed a valuable family asset to become a catastrophic tax liability. We are offering a humane, generous exit. We simply ask that she withdraw her frivolous, retaliatory countersuit and let the conservatorship proceed, ensuring her financial stability. He carefully omitted any mention of the stewardship covenant or the forgery. His legal team, though now aware of the covenant's existence, was operating under the arrogant assumption that it was a mere historical curiosity, easily defeated by modern statutes and Alexander's existing debt structure. They were ready to argue dormancy and unenforceability. I remained silent, allowing Veda to manage the initial exchange. My role was to project absolute, unshakable calm, the eye of the storm. Veda, sharp and entirely unemotional, did not defend my competency. She went straight to the attack. Mr. Thorne's assessment of the situation is fundamentally flawed and relies on a willful misrepresentation of the governing legal documents. We are not here to debate Mrs. Dubois's financial acuity. We are here to establish the legal status of the property and the legal standing of Mr. Thorne. She pushed 3 documents across the polished mahogany. The emergency injunction, freezing a substantial portion of Alexander's liquid assets. The forensic report detailing the forgery of my signature on the quitclaim deed. And the petition for forfeiture. The room reacted to the injunction first. The bank representative immediately stiffened, grabbing the document with a sharp intake of breath. That was the language of finance. The language Alexander spoke. The freezing of assets meant risk, and risk meant default. But the real devastating blow was the petition for forfeiture. Alexander grabbed the document, his face immediately clouding with a mix of fury and disbelief. This is baseless, retaliatory. That document is a piece of antique trash. It's been superseded a dozen times. He yelled, the facade of corporate composure shattering. Veda responded with surgical precision, her voice cutting through his outburst. Mr. Thorne, the document in question is the original 1925 deed, containing the covenant of Thorne's stewardship. It is not trash. It is the foundation of every subsequent trust and the governing charter of the sanctuary. Your lawyers failed to find it because they only looked for what they wanted to see. Veda paused, deliberately drawing out the moment, letting the realization of his legal incompetence sink into his audience, the investors and the bankers. We are now asking the panel to confirm the covenant's validity and, crucially, to confirm that Mr. Thorne's actions specifically, filing a petition to liquidate the sanctuary for commercial, constitute a direct and immediate breach of the covenant's primary mandate. She then pulled out the core piece of evidence, the text of the covenant itself, enlarged and printed on a single stark page. With the court's permission, Veda announced, looking at the silent, pale-faced mediator, I will read the clause that governs the present situation. The silence in the room was absolute. This was the moment of truth, the climax built over a lifetime of betrayal and strategic foresight. Veda's voice, clear and cold, filled the room, reading the archaic talese, unforgiving language of the forfeiture and indemnity clause. Any familial stakeholder who takes or attempts to take explicit recorded action to propose, initiate, or profit from the commercial development or liquidation of the protected lands shall be deemed to have violated the sacred stewardship of the Thorne name. Veda stopped, letting the definition of violation hang in the air. Alexander's conservatorship petition, filed just days prior, was the physical embodiment of that explicit recorded action. Then, Veda continued, her voice gaining a resonant power upon finding of such violation. The attempting party shall suffer immediate and irrevocable forfeiture of all voting rights, executive control, and beneficial interest in the trust and the associated lands. Alexander, watching his entire legacy dissolve by words from 1925, was visibly shaking, his eyes darting frantically to his head lawyer, who stared back with blank horror. Veda delivered the final, crushing line of the covenant. Furthermore, the violating party shall be personally and perpetually liable for all legal, administrative, and expert costs incurred by the primary steward in the defense of the covenant, and shall pay a punitive ecological restoration fine, calculated from the time of breach, payable from their personal estate, in full and without reservation. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in a low, furious murmur of calculated self-preservation. The bank representative slammed the table. One of the investors immediately rose from his seat, his face a mask of cold fury. Mr. Thorne, the investor snapped, ignoring the stunned mediator. This punitive indemnity. Is this legitimate? Is this enforceable? Did your firm miss this document? Alexander, stripped bare, could only manage a strangled, desperate defense. It's an antique. It's procedural noise. Mother is using an obsolete rule to blackmail me. Veda took center stage, her posture impeccable. The covenant is cited in all subsequent trust amendments, which your firm reviewed, Mr. Thorne. It is an active legal mechanism, renewed annually through the mandated declaration of continuous adherence, which Mrs. Dubois diligently filed for 40 years. Your team's failure to find it does not invalidate its power. It proves their negligence and critically confirms Mr. Thorne's malicious intent to bypass the governing law. She then introduced the forensic report, placing it next to the covenant. We have provided evidence of the attempted forgery of Mrs. Dubois's signature on a quitclaim deed. Mr. Thorne's strategy was not a rescue. It was a corporate raid backed by criminal intent. The covenant was designed to stop precisely this kind of betrayal. I spoke then for the first time, my voice quiet, cutting through the rising panic. Alexander, you offered me financial ruin to acquire the land. The covenant now offers you a legally perfect, financially irreversible consequence for that choice. The bank representative, a man named Mr. Harrington, ignored Alexander entirely and addressed Veda. Sterling, if this covenant is confirmed, is Mr. Thorne's corporate collateral, his shares in Thorne Heritage Development, still subject to this punitive fine? Absolutely, Veda confirmed, her eyes meeting Harrington's. The covenant stipulates payment from the personal estate, which includes all corporate holdings established or utilized to further the breach. Furthermore, the covenant's punitive fine is indexed to inflation from 1925. Calculated on the maximum commercial value of the land, the initial estimate puts the punitive cost well above the current valuation of Thorne Heritage Development. The weight of the betrayal was now secondary to the overwhelming weight of the financial loss. The investors and bankers were no longer interested in family drama. They were interested in mitigating the catastrophe Alexander had caused. They realized they had risked their capital backing a man whose entire foundation, the Thorne name, is about to be legally and ethically revoked. One of the investors stood up, not looking at Alexander. The funding agreement is contingent on the lawful acquisition of the Cypress Creek Sanctuary, free of undisclosed encumbrances. The existence of this covenant constitutes a fundamental material misrepresentation on the part of Mr. Thorne. We consider this partnership terminated, effective immediately. This was the boardroom bloodbath. Not a shot fired, but a complete financial and social dismantling. Orchestrated by a document from 1925 and the foresight of a determined matriarch, Alexander was being canceled by his own world. Alexander tried a final, desperate plea directed at me. Mother, stop this. I'm your son. You can't bankrupt your own family over an old tree. It's vengeance. Vengeance is emotional. Alexander, I replied, standing slowly, taking deliberate ownership of the room. I walked to the head of the table, placing my hands on the pristine glass surface. This is not vengeance. This is the execution of principle. You chose to make the land negotiable. Elias ensured the principle was not. You signed your own warrant when you filed that conservatorship petition. I looked directly at the mediator, signaling the finality of the session. The evidence of Mr. Thorne's intent, the forgery, and the activation of the covenant are clear. We are seeking a court date immediately to confirm the forfeiture and to initiate the financial audit for punitive damages. The investors, now in damage control mode, began filing out, silent except for the sharp clicking of briefcases. Mr. Harrington. The banker lingered only long enough to give Alexander a look of utter, cold disgust before following them out. Alexander's magnificent glass-walled boardroom, the very symbol of his power, was suddenly empty, exposing him as a broken, isolated figure. He was left standing alone, surrounded by the remnants of his ambition, the printed words of the covenant, the forensic report of his criminal fraud, and the heavy silence of his defeat. He was not just defeated. He was professionally obliterated. I turned to leave Veda beside me, her expression one of quiet, professional triumph. As we reached the door, Alexander spoke one last time, his voice hollow. "You won't get away with this, Mother," he whispered. "You'll be alone. You'll have nothing but that swamp." I stopped and turned, delivering the final defining line of the segment. "I won't be alone, Alexander. I will have the land, the integrity of the covenant, and You are the one who will be alone, stripped of the only thing you ever truly valued, the prestige of the Thorne name, which you proved entirely unworthy of bearing." I walked out of the opulent, empty boardroom, leaving him to face the total collapse of his kingdom. The boardroom bloodbath was over. The covenant had been read aloud, and its cold, unwavering justice had been delivered. My strategic transformation from victim to matriarch was complete. The focus now shifted entirely to the final. Moral victory, the sanctity of the land itself, the judges ruling the legal. Declaration of forfeiture was merely the opening bell. The true destruction of Alexander's life was not carried out in a courtroom. But in the merciless arenas of finance and society dictated by the ironclad terms of the stewardship covenant, he had coveted a $50 million asset. Now, the price of his entitlement would be everything he had ever built, precisely as Elias Thorne had foreseen. The financial collapse began within hours of the public verdict. The news hit the wire services simultaneously. Thorne Heritage Development CEO loses multi-million-dollar asset, faces punitive fines for environmental and cultural fraud. Veda had orchestrated the leak perfectly, ensuring the narrative was fixed. Alexander was not a victim, but a disqualified environmental criminal, his primary lender. The Metropolitan Bank acted with savage speed. The covenant's punitive indemnity clause, the potential for hundreds of millions in fines, triggered an immediate default on his corporate loans. The bank was interested in one thing: recovering its exposure before Alexander's empire completely dissolved under the weight of the covenant's legal obligations. Alexander's corporate assets, high-rise offices, his development funds, his personal stock portfolio were instantly frozen and subject to seizure to cover the initial court-mandated assessment of the punitive fine. He had gambled his entire life on the assumption that he could break the covenant. The covenant, in turn, demanded his entire life as payment. The irony was absolute. He had sought to liquidate Cypress Creek. Now his entire professional life was being liquidated to protect it. I did not gloat. I watched the process with the cold, detached precision of a matriarch observing a necessary clearing. My focus was purely on the execution of the principle. Veda ensured that every seized asset was immediately directed toward the sanctuary's newly established Restoration and Defense Fund, ensuring that Alexander's downfall directly financed the long-term preservation of the land he tried to destroy. The social destruction was arguably more devastating than the financial ruin. Alexander had spent 2 decades building a facade of prestige based entirely on the inherited dignity of the Thorne name, which he had legally forfeited. His expulsion from the Thorne legacy was immediate and total. The network of influential partners, investors, and social peers who had flocked to his power now evaporated. These were people who valued reputation above all else. Being associated with a proven forger and a documented environmental vandal was professional poison. Alexander was summarily removed from the boards of every philanthropic and cultural organization he had leveraged for status. The quiet condemnation from his former associates was more crushing than any public outcry. He had become a pariah not for failing to make money, but for the moral and legal failure to uphold his family's ethical contract. I received a brief, cold letter from the senior members of the extended Thorne family descent, cousins who relied on the names, stating their unequivocal support for the court's findings and confirming Alexander's permanent disassociation from the family's historical holdings and social events. The judgment was complete. Alexander was stripped of his corporate identity, his wealth, and, most crucially, his name. He was left with only the emptiness of his own ambition. The emotional layering here was complex. The script needed to express the profound sorrow of witnessing the self-destruction of a child, while maintaining the matriarch's unwavering resolve. The punishment was just, but the loss was still real. Veda managed the liquidation with ruthless efficiency, ensuring compliance with the covenant's punitive fine. The complexity of unraveling Alexander's financial structures, the corporate shells, the leveraged assets took months, but Veda was relentless. Every discovery reinforced the initial finding. Alexander had indeed built his entire corporate life on the assumption of risk-free greed. The final financial reckoning revealed the total cost of his entitlement. The punitive ecological restoration fine, indexed to inflation since 1925, exceeded $200 million. This figure, combined with the legal costs, guaranteed that Alexander was left with virtually nothing. He was declared personally bankrupt, his corporate entity dissolved, and his ability to practice high finance permanently compromised by the court's finding of malicious intent. and fraud. He was legally barred from ever attempting to acquire or influence any conservation land. A permanent black mark on his professional life. The psychological dimension of the destruction was the final victory for the Covenant. Alexander was a man defined by his success. Failure, especially public, legally documented failure, was his deepest fear. The Matriarch's win was designed to hit this vulnerability directly. I learned that he had attempted a desperate final appeal, arguing that the Covenant violated his constitutional rights. Veda's countersuit was a single, devastating sentence. The Covenant was entered into voluntarily, and the forfeiture clause was triggered by his own documented act of fraudulent intent, not by mere economic failure. The appeal was dismissed summarily. The physical evidence of the destruction soon followed. His high-rise apartment in the city was sold to cover immediate legal costs. His assets were absorbed by the sanctuary's defense fund. He was forced to retreat entirely from the sophisticated life he had so arrogantly claimed as his birthright. There was a final, painful communication. Alexander sent a short, typed letter, devoid of apology, filled only with bitter self-pity, blaming the antiquated laws and my vindictive bitterness for his ruin. He refused to acknowledge the forgery or the Covenant's principle. This lack of remorse cemented my resolve. His destruction was not an act of vengeance. It was an act of necessary surgical protection. He had shown himself to be an existential threat to the sanctuary, and the Matriarch had the duty to neutralize that threat completely. I did not reply to his letter. I simply filed it away with the other documents, the Conservatorship petition, the forgery report as the final evidence of the moral corruption that necessitated his expulsion. The profound justice of the situation was that the sanctuary, my life's purpose, was now financially secure because the very man who tried to destroy it was forced to pay for its perpetuity. Alexander's greed had inadvertently become the largest endowment fund the Cypress Creek Trust had ever received. The consequence of his entitlement was absolute. Alexander faded into the anonymity he had always feared, his life a complete reversal of the prestige he had sought. He was no longer the brilliant, ambitious CEO. He was a footnote in a massive environmental law case, warning to others who might attempt to monetize. Principled stewardship. My final duty was to ensure the sanctuary was reinforced against any future threats. The massive infusion of funds from the liquidation of Quadasconder's estate allowed the trust to purchase surrounding vulnerable parcels of land, expanding the protected ecosystem. The price of his entitlement became the guarantee of the land's eternal preservation. As I stood by the marsh, watching the bog turtles bask in the sun, I felt no triumph, only a quiet, resolute peace. The war was over. The price had been exacted. The Covenant had held. The final victory was the certainty that the land would remain forever untouched by the destructive hand of greed. My personal sacrifice was now sealed by the permanent safety of the sanctuary. The only remaining task was to define the future, the true meaning of the reclaimed sanctuary, the final verdict. The liquidation of Alexander's assets and the formal disassociation from the Thorn name were not the end of the journey. They were the liberation. The silence that settled over Cypress Creek was no longer the tense, watchful quiet of war, but the profound restorative peace of a reclaimed sanctuary. I had fought for the land, but in doing so, had won back my true self, the Evelyn defined by purpose, not by obligation, my house. Once the staging ground for corporate betrayal now felt cleansed, I walked through the rooms, noticing the details that Alexander had dismissed as worthless. The uneven grain of the ancient pine floors, the salt-kissed air coming through the open windows, the scent of wood smoke and marsh grass. These were the assets that truly mattered. And they were finally safe. The funds from Alexander's forfeited estate, the largest financial infusion the trust had ever received, were immediately put to work, executing the next phase of the Covenant's mandate. Perpetual expansion and security. We established the Alexander Thorn Endowment for Ecological Restoration. The name was not an act of mockery, but a final, powerful legal statement. The wealth generated by his ambition would forever be dedicated to undoing the very damage his greed represented. His legacy was not the development he envisioned, but the eternal preservation of the land he tried to destroy. The first major act of my reclaimed stewardship was the acquisition of 3 adjacent parcels of vulnerable marshland. These lands, previously threatened by small-scale development, were critical buffers to the sanctuary. Alexander's final act of destruction inadvertently secured the largest expansion of Cypress Creek in its history. This was the true definition of victory, not merely defending the lines, but pushing the principle forward. My freedom was now inextricably linked to the land's greater security. I no longer felt the cold, hard resolve of the litigator. That part of me had served its purpose. I felt the warm, deep satisfaction of the matriarch redeemed up woman who had faced the most brutal form of familial betrayal and emerged not broken, but stronger and more rooted than before. The years that followed were dedicated to cementing the covenant's enduring power. Veda Sterling remained a trusted advisor, helping to establish new, legally robust mechanisms for oversight. We institutionalized the Environmental Edge. The trust established the Elias Thorne Center for Coastal Stewardship, transforming the original main house into a center for ecological research and community education. The goal was to ensure that the covenant's principles were not just filed in a courthouse, but actively taught to a new generation. I saw the quiet humor in this situation. The house Alexander had scorned as an obsolete burden was now a thriving hub of environmental science. Financed entirely by his forfeited wealth, I began hosting small, regular educational tours of the sanctuary. I would lead groups of students, researchers, and local residents through the marsh, pointing out the rare orchids, the intricate roots of the cypress trees, and the telltale tracks of the bog turtles. I spoke of the land's history, its vital role in the ecosystem, and the absolute necessity of the covenant. Crucially, I never spoke of Alexander's name on these tours, except to mention the endowment that funded the research center. His betrayal became an anonymous, cautionary tale woven into the fabric of the covenants. Success a profound erasure that was far more potent than any public shaming. The contrast with the competitor's story was clear, where the competitor's protagonist found a personal sanctuary in a renovated basement. I found a public, living, and perpetual sanctuary in the covenant's thriving mission. My legacy was no longer about personal survival. It was about institutional survival. My personal life was simple, focused on the steady, restorative rhythms of the sanctuary. I resumed the work I had postponed for decades, contributing to scientific journals, documenting the native flora, and simply listening to the quiet breathing of the land. I often reflected on the nature of freedom. Alexander believed freedom was the liberty to exploit and profit without restriction. I learned that true freedom was the liberation from unnecessary obligation and the liberty to pursue one's true, life-defining purpose without external interference. My final act of self-definition was formalizing my own will, adhering strictly to the covenant's mandates. I ensured that the future stewardship role would pass not based on blood, but on demonstrated, verifiable commitment to the covenant's principles. I established a rigorous process for assessing future stewards, ensuring that any successor would possess the same deep understanding of the land's ecological and legal integrity. This was the ultimate lesson learned from Alexander's betrayal. Legacy must be earned through purpose, not assumed through birthright. The sorrow over Alexander diminished over time, replaced by a quiet acceptance of his chosen path. He had chosen greed, and the covenant had simply executed the consequences of that choice. I realized that my own dignity was not dependent on his repentance, but on my commitment to the truth. My connection with the extended Thorne family was restored, built now on the foundation of respect for my defense of the name's integrity. They saw me not as a sentimental relative, but as the formidable protector of the family's true, non-commercial wealth. They began funding new research initiatives at the center, aligning their influence with the covenant's ethical principles. The emotional layering here focused on the serenity and wisdom achieved through conflict. The matriarch's voice, once cold with strategic resolve, now projected deep. Enduring peace. I spent my later years doing what I loved most, walking the expanded perimeter of the sanctuary, accompanied only by the sound of the marsh birds and the rustle of the longleaf pines. I would often visit the ancient pecan tree, where Elias and I once spoke of promises and principles. I would touch the rough bark, remembering the fear of that moment when Alexander first presented his ultimatum, and the profound relief of discovering the covenant. I understood then that Elias's gift was not just the deed, but the courage to uphold it. He gave me the necessary weapon, and I found the strength to fire it. Even when the target was my own son, the sanctuary was not just my home. It was the physical manifestation of my moral victory. Every thriving bog turtle, every clean drop of water filtering through the marsh, was proof that principles, when legally protected and diligently upheld, can defeat the most powerful forms of modern cynicism. I often thought of the $50 million Alexander coveted. That figure was meaningless. The true worth was the perpetuity I had secured thee, guarantee that the marsh would endure long after the fleeting fortunes of greedy men were forgotten. My life became a quiet testament to the covenant's wisdom. I was free from financial anxiety, free from the burdens of emotional obligation, and free to pursue my life's most important work. I was simply Evelyn, the steward, defined by the integrity of the land I protected. As I reflect now on the journey, I realize the matriarch's true legacy is not wealth, but autonomy. Alexander tried to steal my future. The covenant gave me back my past and guaranteed my freedom. I learned that one must be willing to sacrifice the illusion of peace and familial harmony to preserve one's fundamental purpose. The sanctuary remains, protected by the ironclad laws of a century-old deed, financed by the greed it crushed. The land will continue its vital work, filtering water, sheltering life, and standing as a permanent monument to the enduring power of principle. My story is not one of revenge, but one of restoration, the restoration of legal integrity, the restoration of the ecosystem, and the restoration of my own definition of self. I define my freedom on my own terms, anchored to the unwavering purpose of the Cypress Creek Sanctuary. The matriarch's will had been done.